It's a delight to be here with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, who, among many other talents and occupations, teaches a lot of Torah and social justice spaces and serves as the director of the Avodah Justice Fellowship. Thanks for taking time to talk.
My pleasure. Thanks to be here.
So 4 years ago, we talked. I interviewed you on the topic of slave reparations.
Right.
And since then, you've taught about that, but in particular, you wrote an article in Medium, which I will link to below, on this issue, which has stirred many others to think about the issue as well.
The Torah case for reparations.
Torah case for reparations in Medium. So let's start in the abstract, just on the Torah front. How do we, as a basic Jewish framework, think about this issue? Are we responsible for the sins of our ancestors?
That's a good question, because I actually didn't really address that. That's the obvious question at the end of the article, where the article, really goes through all the Torah passages around the Israelites' departure from Egypt and taking a lot of property from the Egyptians, and the fact that the rabbinic tradition clearly understood that as sloppy reparations, because there wasn't going to be a claims committee or whatever. And so I can understand a kind of response that looks at that and says, yeah, definitely Torah, our whole Torah identity is based on reparations, and there's a whole future to that. And similarly here, if we were talking about like in 1875, the Jewish tradition would have to articulate for reparations here. But what about now? A lot of people say, like, I never owned slaves, God forbid. I never enslaved people. I was never connected to that. Even Jim Crow, I'm so far removed. Is it still relevant after all this time? So what I've been thinking about in the last couple of years about that, I think I want to start with a surprising, overlooked moment in the Yom Kippur liturgy, when right before we say the Ashamnu Bagadnu, the vidui, the confession, we introduce it by saying Aval anachnu va'avotenu chatanu, in most versions of the liturgy. Indeed, we and our ancestors have sinned. And it's an interesting question. What does it mean to specifically mention our ancestors? Why the Yom Kippur? It's about our personal accountability for everything that we've done. And, if you look in the 5th chapter of Vayikra, of Leviticus, where it goes through a person's responsibilities for any time they commit a sin, it's like right then you have to confess your individual sin and bring a sacrifice. And similarly, in the 16th chapter of Vayikra, the laws for Yom Kippur, for the annual purge, also, it says it's very individualistic language, confess your personal sins and bring an offering. In the 26th chapter of Vayikra, which is the curses, what's described there is this cyclical, like really gruesome pattern of the entire nation being sunken in all sorts of terrible, sinful life. A lot of it is even described very generally. It doesn't even often always say with great particularity what sins, but sinful life and refusing to repent and getting deeper and deeper enmeshed in it. And around verse 39 or 40 there in chapter 26, the Torah says that at this deep level of continued punishment after continued sinning, they will melt away, the people will melt away in their own sins and the sins of their ancestors. And finally after that, they will confess their own sins and the sins of their ancestors. And Chazal, the rabbis in the Midrash on this verse, on the Sifra, ask really the same question you opened with, like, why should we be responsible for the sins of our ancestors? Melev, like the sins that they're doing, but why are they melting away for the sins of their ancestors? In fact, that contradicts the Torah. Torah says in the book of Devarim, very famously, Lo yimtu avot al banim velo banim yimtu al avot avotam. Like, parents cannot be executed for the sins of their children, nor children for the sins of their parents. Individual responsibility. How can it be that here in Vayikra, the Torah is saying that the punishment will include punishment for the sins of the ancestors? And the answer in the Midrash is that this applies whenever people are tofsim ba'avonot avotehem, when you're still grabbing on to the sins of their ancestors. Children can't be punished for the sins of their ancestors to the extent that they're separate sins. So put it in very concrete terms. Like if I find out my grandfather smoked cigarettes, and I think smoking cigarettes is forbidden by Jewish law, I'm not responsible for that. Or my grandparents ate treif. The return to Judaism came later in my family. My grandparents ate treif. I'm not responsible for that theologically. That's what Devarim is coming to tell us. Children can't be executed for or held accountable for the sins of their ancestors. They made their choices. They face accountability in whatever ways they do based on your theology, and I have my own life. However, what if my ancestors stole money or defrauded somebody and then bequeathed the money to my parents, who then had, were able to create a trust fund, and then I was able to continue to benefit from it. Or I went into the family business that was built on this wealth. So that's where I think you're seeing more the subtler cases where Vayikra comes in. And where the Rambam and Rabbeinu Yonah and other poskim legal authorities who deal with Yom Kippur law and Tshuva law, repentance law, say, to whatever extent people are still holding on to the sins of their ancestors, they're responsible for the sins of their ancestors. Now you look at America today, so the formal institution of slavery ended in 1865, but it's impossible to say, and I think we've had amazing literature written in recent years, really putting numbers on the degree to which the ideology and the oppressive frameworks represented by slavery have continued to exist in American life in different forms, through the Jim Crow laws, through contract selling, through housing discrimination, the housing crisis of 2008, and on and on and on. White supremacy is still very much alive and well, certainly through the criminal justice system. And I'm not, there are read Michelle Alexander and Ta-Nehisi Coates and many other people in terms of really seeing the clarity of the case on that, Brian Stevenson. But once that's clear, can we really say that we're not holding on to the sins of our ancestors? So I think the simplest cases are there are universities, University of Chicago and Johns Hopkins and I think Johns Hopkins, maybe not Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, Harvard, where there have been reparations committees based on the fact that the university was founded or built up with slavery money, and that has continued to play forward. But I think more broadly in American society, the wealth of America is inconceivable without the institution of slavery and the successive institutions post-slavery of white supremacy and structural racism. And we're all to different degrees there are different degrees of complicity, but it's really spread throughout the society. There's one girsa, one textual variant of the Midrash that doesn't say tofsim ba'avonot avotam, holding on to the sins of their ancestors, but tfusim ba'avonot avotam, in the grip of the sins of their ancestors. If that's the version of the Midrash, then it's even broader. I think it really captures. There might be a lot of people who'd be like, but I'm anti-racist, Right. I even retweeted Black Lives Matter stuff, and I think the racism is terrible. We're still caught up in it. There's no, just being whited in America makes us tools of other people's racism in all sorts of different ways, with interaction with housing discrimination and so on. So it might not be my fault if I go to check out an apartment and I'm given favorable treatment because I'm seen as a positive potential tenant, not knowing that landlord is displacing people of color. That might not be my fault, but I'm caught up in it. I'm caught up. We all have to do societal change. So to me, that's really our tradition telling us, Aval anachnu v'avotenu chatanu. That's a core part of our Yom Kippur worship, and that really animates our spiritual life the rest of the year. Yeah. We are accountable for the sins of our ancestors that we're caught up in.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. The other layer is it's been suggested by many that the only reason America became a superpower was because of the greatest exploitation of slavery in human history. And I wonder, is there now a debt to the global south or to other countries where we had a major competitive advantage and we're able to exploit not only slaves in America, but essentially countries around the world because of that?
Yeah.
Some of the Mefarshim on...
And not just America, France to Haiti.
Oh,
and reparations are not just in American slavery context. I think part of what the Torah case for reparations... I played it out with most focus on this lane, but I think it's a theological orientation. We are a reparations-oriented people. We believe that when there has been exploitation and theft, it has to be remunerated.
So some of those Mefarshim, some of those commentators on that particular stira, that contradiction in verses you pointed out, explain that... that I am responsible for those sins because I am likely, as we know empirically, to still be doing what my ancestors did. And I might frame it as ancestors. Maybe it's a mitigating factor, but it's not an excuse. I can't say, I'm just doing what my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did. But it's a small mitigating factor because I'm doing what I was raised to do, and yet you're still responsible. And so I wonder, how do we think both about the difference between perpetuation versus privilege? I have inherited the power and privilege that has come from this, and so there's a responsibility, even if I'm not still perpetuating certain crimes, versus I am still a perpetrator of that history as well. Is there a different responsibility that emerges from?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know how much that would play out in terms of like. If H.R. 40 was passed into law, the congressional committee was formed, like how much, because mainly we'd be talking about like tax structures and distribution that would be national. But in Achinami, I think people who more actively perpetuate racism or more actively hold on to and hoard their privilege are more guilty and more liable than people who are trying to undo it and trying to resist, but are also part of the system, or people in the middle who aren't necessarily paying attention. So granted, I think if somebody, I think if you are aware that the business that you inherited from your parents was built with stolen money and you intentionally continue to like not do anything to redress it, then you're more obligated, they're more liable than somebody who's not owning a company at all. But that's I think largely a theological question. I think that's less of a political question, more of a theological one. I'd be like, that's the work you should be doing.
How do you think about justice versus healing? Now, I think we should prioritize justice versus over healing. But, for example, if you compare the Nazi reparations, not Nazi, German reparations, there we see justice, we can't call that justice, so a small piece of justice takes place. And I don't know if that leads to healing or not, probably not. But then you look at South Africa, a truth and reconciliation process that is not involved in reparations, but is engaged in a healing kind of dialogue process. What do we learn from those two cases about anything? And do you think that this would clearly lead to some justice around social mobility? But would it lead to any form of white-black healing, or more importantly, black healing?
I'll mainly defer to others on that. Well, I'll say, like, Ta-Nehisi Coates in his article, The Case for Reparations, if you haven't read it yet, you got to do it. The Atlantic, 2013, republished in We Were 8 Years in Power. In any event, he addresses that at the end, and the end sort of begins to hedge. Like, most of the article, he's making the case based on monetary plunder, not just slavery, but also the whole section on discriminatory housing in Chicago and so on. And then in the end, as he brings it it widens the lens to a more spiritual view of like ending white guilt, ending just like the sickness of America. He mentions South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and in an interesting way, he seems to open the door for a reparations process, not even really dealing with all the dollars. And he got some criticism for that. I haven't read all of it. I'm not. My general orientation is that, for the most part, I think that remuneration and healing and relationship building always go hand in hand, and because you're never finished with one, you can't wait till one is finished to start the second one. Like, there's a degree to which the plunder, any price tag we put on it will be undershooting it by a lot, which is what our rabbinic literature hints at in the Talmud and Sanhedrin, when generations later the Egyptians sue Bnei Israel in Alexander the Great's court for all that stuff you took from us, and they're like, "Oh, you want to play that game? All right, we'll countersue you for wages for all the hundreds of years of unpaid labor." And then the Egyptians don't show up in court the next day. So like the implication is that whatever price tag we put on it is actually undershooting. Be that as it may, I do think that for the most part the remunerations has to precede. I'm not well read. I'm not not a scholar on the history of the South African Truth and Reconciliation process and what's happened in the subsequent years. And so if anything I'm about to say is actually wrong, I defer to anybody. My impression is that it's been a mixed process. It definitely led to some. It didn't just lead to. It was important. I don't underestimate the importance of being able to face your oppressor and name it and have them have to listen to it. But when you know that the structural poverty that they caused is going to go uncorrected, and that the condition for them showing up and agreeing to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the knowledge that they're not going to be held accountable, I think it loses a lot. So personally, I've been thinking about it more in terms of actual monetary reparations, and even with the understanding that it may be insufficient. But let's get H.R. 40 into law. Let's create this congressional commission to really study it, to really study how to do it, or at least how to start. And a lot of that's got to start monetarily.
Okay, fascinating. Last question for you. So, what about the American Jew who says, "But I'm not an ancestor of slave owners. I'm not a descendant. Descendant." And of course, Jews were slave owners, like everyone who lived in the South, or most white folks, Jews. But the majority of Jews today are not descendants of Southern slave owners; they're immigrants. And so, what do you make of that response?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because like the language of the Midrash and the Sifra, everything is and in the Torah itself, in Vayikra, is Avotam, your direct ancestors. And it's a little bit slippery, because does the Torah mean your literal ancestors or your forebears? It is in the curses in Vayikra 26, it is talking about ongoing generational sin, which already points towards something beyond genetic or family connection. But where I think this really gets the most power, to close back with the Rambam, Rambam has a very famous letter to a person named Ovadia, who was a convert, Ovadia Hager, writes this letter to the Rambam dripping with pathos. It's really, we don't have, to my knowledge, Ovadia's actual letter, but we have the Rambam quoting parts of it back in the introduction to his response. And the pathos are dripping. So Ovadia is a righteous convert who loves Torah and mitzvot and is observing it with great, commitment and alacrity. And he writes to the Rambam, and he lists all these parts of the liturgy. And he's saying, can I say, Eloheinu v'Elohe Avotenu, our God and God of our ancestors? Can I take an aliyah to the Torah and say, Asher bachar banu mikol hamim, praise are you, God, who chose us from among the nations? am I part of us if my ancestors weren't there? The Rambam, and a lot of people, when they read this letter of the Rambam, are shocked because they take it as a given that in Judaism, of course, converts are total Jews for everything, and we're like, it's like this, mythic thing that happens by coming out of the mikveh and accepting
retroactive shift.
You were there at Mount Sinai, and but the source for that is this letter from the Rambam to an actual convert, and there was some controversy around this, and he's very forceful about it and says that when Avraham made his commitments, when Avraham bequeathed this this legacy not only to his genetic descendants but to the people he tried to influence, that affect all of us. By entering into the covenant, you are a child of Avraham and everything else. That is the Jewish approach to nationhood, to being part of something. So to me, I think it would be very strange for a Jewish person who lives with regard to Jewish life, who lives with that kind of orientation, for whom, of course, Jews by choice say Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'Natan Lanu Et Torato Eloheinu V'Elohe Avotenu, etc. For that person to say, oh, but Washington and Jefferson weren't my ancestors. Actually, my people were in the Ukraine at that time. And also, I would push back and say, have you ever taken off work for July 4th?
Right.
Or gone to a parade? Have you ever gone to a basketball game and stood up for the national anthem? Do you know the words? Do you ever pledge allegiance if you went to school? Certainly, if you've done any of those things, if you've embraced the American mythology, if you've related to Washington and Jefferson as the founding fathers, then you can't now come and say, but they're the founding fathers as long as they're not responsible for the bad things they did. You've embraced them as your people.
Constitutional benefits,
Right. Did you get excited about Hamilton beyond your, there are some people who just love every musical or love nerd rap or something. But the people who are never listen to rap music and don't go to musicals but were super excited about Hamilton, you're into the American mythology and you consider it your own. All the more, but even beyond that, even if you're not, even if you take a knee during the national anthem and you think it's bogus that slave owners like Washington or like Andrew Jackson, who was responsible for the Trail of Tears and genocide, that they're on the money, and you think Harriet Tubman should be in their place, even if you think that, and you're not really a patriot in this way, you're still protected by the U.S. Constitution. If you travel abroad, you've got that passport. And I think that's the same way that, I think rabbinic language for that might be, once you've converted in, or some ancestors of yours converted in, and now you're just a Jew, and now you're not so into it anymore, and you're angry at God, or you don't do the mitzvot, or whatever the case may be, you're still in it. And you're Yisrael, Yisrael, who Jews are still liable for it. So I think I've heard Jewish people make that argument before. I think it's a very strange argument for a Jewish person to make that doesn't. To make that argument, you'd have to have a completely unrelated quarantine. You'd have to have a relationship to Torah and Jewish life that is totally quarantined from your civic life, and that's not something I see playing out in other ways in Jewish life, often among those same people who are, the whole Reform, conservative, modern Orthodox Jewish life, and even parts of the Haredi world that are involved in lobbying on issues of Jewish concern. We're part of this thing. It's very different than some countries the Jews lived in the past, where it was we're laying low. We don't take responsibility for any of this. Jews are part of the American story. We're well represented in elected government and in the courts and so on. We're part of it, and if if we live in the world of the Rambam,
Yeah.
where the fact of opting into a story means that we're responsible for everything that happened in the past, you can't be selective about what we pick from George Washington's cherry tree. Like, if we benefit from the fruits of it, we're also responsible for the enslavement, the genocide of natives, and everything. It's all one. We're part of it all.
Fascinating stuff. Make sure to check out Aryeh's article in Medium. We'll post it below, and a longer podcast coming out later today on slave reparations, and another on violence and rabbinic thought. Thanks so much.